All right, we are now live for another political theory and practice discussion. And today we're going to be talking about Michel Foucault and specifically the, subject matter of this volume, Power. I moved this up a day in part because I've moved the Worlds of Speculative Fiction event that I'll be doing next weekend, which was going to be happening today. I moved that in time to next Saturday, in part because I have to do more prep work for that. So I thought that this would be a good thing to chat about and discuss with people. So we'll see how many people make it to the stream. I'm going to talk for a bit, and then I will end up taking questions, comments, addressing anything that people want to bring up. So we'll give it a couple minutes, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the series for everybody who's maybe new to it or people who are watching this. So I started doing this political theory and discussion series as kind of a monthly streaming thing a while back. And sometimes we talk about contemporary issues in politics. Sometimes we talk about some key things to know if we want to do political theory well, such as, thinking about the American scene and how fragmented into local governments everything is, and that'll actually come up with this Foucault stuff when we're talking about power relations. And sometimes we talk about key ideas or contributions that have been made by particular, for the most part, political philosophers, although, we could expand this into other people as well, sociologists, straight out political theorists. And this is one of those. So we're going to talk about Michel Foucault's conception of power relations. And I imagine there'll probably be a good bit of dispelling mistaken viewpoints on Foucault and his work and his ideas and contributions. But we'll get into that as time goes on. So Mark is here. Glad to see you. Anybody else, if you want to chime in, say where you're watching from or stuff like that. I always get a kick out of that. Mark is watching from South Africa, so it's kind of late there. It's noon here in Milwaukee, downtown, and could be anything depending on where you are all over the world. So let's jump in and let's talk about Michel Foucault and his ideas about power. So one of the key contributions is adding a different term to our vocabulary. Instead of just talking about power, he talks about power relations. And we're going to get into that. Connor asks, are you going to touch on biopower? Obviously, we'll touch on biopower, but biopower is very overrated and not as big of a deal as people make it out to be. I'll pull the curtain back on that one. So I'm going to start actually with a few bits of advice. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings of Foucault and the relevance of his ideas and what the content of the ideas are, and about his basic approach. And, living in this internet age, there are some amazing opportunities that it puts in our lap. For example, being able to do this right here, right now. But there's also a tendency to create superficial, easy takes and understandings. If you think about what it takes to understand a thinker, like, for example, if you want to understand Anselm of Canterbury, you got to actually read the book. You got to read his works, and you got to do it multiple times. And you can't just rely on, what Spark Notes or Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or pick whatever sites or whatever memes or, whatever secondary lit happens to say. Sooner or later, you actually have to do the work of going to the primary text. And with Foucault, this is really, really important because, he's become a popular philosopher in a way. So the same way that Hegel has, the same way that Spinoza has, where there's a lot of circulation of of memes, not just in the terms of the internet memes, but like Richard Dawkins, original notion of meme, um, sort of clusters of ideas, like everything's a prison. Well, I mean, Foucault actually in various places says, no, that's not my view at all. But the everything's a prison thing kind of outweighs that in terms of its cap, its captivating power and its ease of transmission compared to the actual text. Just like with any other thinker, right? We can talk about that, right? Um, and so part of what we want to do in something like this is get to the actual meat. What does Foucault actually say? So here's a couple pointers. Anytime somebody makes a sweeping claim about Foucault's works and ideas, they're probably full of shit. They probably don't know what they're talking about, or they have read it and they're taking some sort of tendentious take, like, Foucault reduces everything to power. If somebody says something like that, you know that they don't know what they're talking about, right? And then you should probably not even bother to engage them, just ignore them and move on to better stuff. Because the other cool thing about the internet is we don't have to like engage people and conversations that are a waste of our time, because there's so many other ones to be involved in. The other thing to realize about that is if you do read Foucault's work, these big sweeping misleading claims about it, like everything's power, everything's a prison, um, we see Foucault himself addressing these. I mean, he knew what people were saying about him, and he deliberately heads off some of those things at the past. Um, Another key pointer. So Foucault is interested in um, exploring and doing so in a rigorous way a number of complex, controversial, interconnected matters, and these spill over. These are messy. He's interested in digging up and in interpreting history. What was the past? How did things develop? He's also interested in what he calls a history of the present. Making sense out of our current situation, and he's interested in thinking about options for us in light of the things that he, um, you know, uh, figures out, the things that he puts in front of us. So we got to be really, really attentive to the limitations and the qualifications, the yes buts, involved in his work. He doesn't lay things out in a um, let's say manifesto style thing. He'll say like, okay, so what do we find is happening? This incredibly complex set of changes, and here's the main traits of it that we can isolate out. Obviously, these are interconnected with each other. Don't expect what I've figured out about, say, prisons in America in the 1800s to immediately transfer onto prisons in America in the 2010s or 2020s. Obviously, he didn't live past the 80s, but he could have said something like that, right? Um, so that's another thing. And the other thing that I want to say is, you know, we also want to avoid a kind of hero worship, and really not just with Foucault, but any thinker who we're involved with, right? We don't have to expect that they've got everything right, or we also don't have to like go to the, oh, postmodernism is bad, or pick whatever else the conservatives are against and have the terrible takes that people like James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson and all them spout out, right? That sort of bullshit. Foucault's not a hero or a villain, and really most people in the history of philosophy shouldn't be viewed that way. We should say, okay, I buy this part, I don't buy this part. Like, for example, when it comes to the history of sexuality and you read the stuff on ancient philosophy, people who don't know much ancient philosophy might buy into Foucault's narratives a little bit too unquestioningly and be like, oh man, this is really cool stuff. But if you know your ancient philosophy, there's points where you're like, ah, come on, guy. Yeah, you don't really expect me to buy that, do you? I've actually read these texts, I see where you're going with this and you're telling a cool story, but I don't really think that you're really pushing your narrative a little bit too hard on this case. So we can endorse Foucault in qualified ways. Until we've done the good bit of work, we do have to resist temptations to misread him and misattribute things, and so that's good to keep in mind as well. So there's already a lot of questions and comments, some of which are relevant, some of which are irrelevant to the topic at hand in the chat. Remember, this is not an AMA. This is focused on understanding Foucault. So we'll talk about that. And I probably won't be addressing the off-topic question stuff. So Foucault talks about power throughout his works, and let me say from the start that you don't have to read all of the stuff that Foucault has written in order to be able to wrap your head around his basic ideas and sort of see where it's going and develop. But you probably do have to read a good bit in order to have a good sense of what he's doing. Otherwise, power becomes a kind of empty referent that can mean whatever you want it to mean, right? And obviously there's a book that you can get which doesn't contain everything that he wrote about the topic, but you would think this would be a pretty useful volume, these selected essays and stuff on power. But there's also, so this is part of a 3-volume set that was kind of in grad school that was coming out, and then there's this one. This one's actually got some important essays as well, like on some of you are mentioning Biopower. Well, that's where you can find some of the important essays in that. So he talks about power in a lot of places, right? And Foucault has a number of different ways in which power and power relations are going to be connected up with things. I would say that, very, very early on, one of his key insights, and it's not an insight unique to Foucault. I mean, this is a insight from that also comes from Nietzsche, and Foucault tells you that Nietzsche was a very important catalyst for people of his generation. That truth and power, how power is used, how power is understood, how power is imposed, are connected with each other. That you don't have any pure truth that's just out there waiting for us to discover. Instead, we live in you could say, humanized world, and a humanized world is one in which there are power relations, very often complex ones that we haven't attended to adequately. It takes power to discover, to enunciate, to develop, to articulate truth, whether we like it or not. And so that's a key insight, and I would say that's there from the very start, right? And then another key thing after we get past his archaeological period and we start getting into the straight out genealogical work, another key idea is that we actually have to look closely at things. We can't just generalize about power structures or things like that. We need to see what history actually reveals to us, and that involves a lot of work and expense and time and thinking. You can't write, Discipline and Punish or The Birth of the Clinic or any of these other works without doing an awful lot of research, right? And that you can say, well, that involves kind of a privileged position. Yeah, sure, totally. That's a critique that's been made against Foucault and Foucauldians for a while, but it's kind of a toothless one because pretty much everything that we do requires something to be subordinated. Here, it's kind of similar to Nietzsche, right? Not everything is necessarily will to power, but there's certainly things that are made to work for other things. Now, when we get to power relations, I actually think that there's a couple. If you only read one thing on Foucault and on power, and this will actually address some of the questions that are being asked, like governmentality. What's that? It's you can read this essay that's in here called "The Subject and Power." That's why I did a series of core concept videos on it, because when I want to have my students read Foucault, there's basically two pieces that I'm having them engage with. I mean, I'm not teaching philosophy majors; I'm teaching art and design majors at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. But they're very interested in continental philosophy and in making sense out of their life. So one of them is The Subject and Power, and the other one is Technologies of the Self, which does talk about power, right? And so those are really central. There's a lot of other really useful essays and stuff like that where we can get that as well. But I think in a way, The Subject and Power, the reason I give it a kind of privileged position is because he hits on a lot of these key ideas and key um, themes and points that he wants to make and terms over and over and over again, right? Um, so anyway, long story short, Foucault is going to talk an awful lot about power. There's, if you had to pick some other things, I would say the essay "Truth and Power" in this volume would be very useful. And if you're super interested in biopower, society must be defended. There's another essay after that, and then the birth of biopower. Those all talk about that in this volume. So let's talk about actually, I'm gonna stop here for a moment. So I see people making sweeping statements about Foucault, and again, I'm going to remind you that if you make sweeping statements about Foucault, like Foucault was a Nietzschean, you're wrong, and you're screwing yourself up. If you want to make sure that you don't understand Foucault, that's a great way to start. Saying that Foucault was an this. That ain't the way to do it. The way to do it is to actually look closely at what Foucault is saying. You can say there could be some influences there, but you shouldn't call them anything in, because that's actually going to lead you off base. All right, back to talking about some of the key ideas. So let's talk about some of the contributions that he's articulating, not making, but articulating in The Subject and Power, right? Um, so, he tells you that the goal of his work has not been to analyze the phenomena of power in order to elaborate the foundations of this. It's been to create a history of the different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects. And you can say, well, why the hell should we care about that, right? Tell me about power instead. Well, because power turns out to be something that is between subjects. A little bit later in the essay, he's going to distinguish between power relations and relations in which a person is so dominated that they're effectively turned into something like a machine or a circuit, or they don't have the possibility of saying no in some way. Power is always something between subjects, right? So that's something really important to keep in mind. And the other thing that we want to look at here is, well, there's several things we want to look at here, but one of the things we want to look at here is what he talks about as not being power, right? So we have power relations. Power relations, he says, are always acting not directly upon the person. Like if you're torturing somebody, that's not a power relation. That's something on their uh, their body. You're treating them as sort of an object, right? Unless you're trying to like coerce information out of them, in which case they have some choices to make. Power relations are actions upon the possible actions of another. If I exert power over you, I am not making you do something in a purely efficient causal way, as if you were a mechanism. And in a certain way, you could say that my relations to this phone, even though it's very anthropomorphized and I have a Siri on it, those are all just mechanical connections, right? Until there's something like an actual subject behind the phone, no power relations. I can have power relations with you through the phone, right? Very complex ones. We can have power relations right here, right? But you have to have actual subjects involved in that. And not every other relation is necessarily a power relation, right? There's lots of other things in our lives, right? He talks about relationships of communication. This is something you're going to see not just in this essay, the subject and power, but also in the order of things. You're going to see this in technologies of the self. Um, Signs and communication, they can be cathected with power. They can be connected up with power in important ways, and they usually are. But communication by itself is not a power relation for Foucault. So this is something I think that is, quite interesting to keep in mind. Relations of production very often involve power relations to make them happen in certain ways, but they are not by themselves power relations. There's things outside, or not necessarily outside, but things that can be distinguished from power. And as a matter of fact, I'm even going to bring up something that's in technologies of the self. So, there Foucault talks about different kinds of technologies, and some of them are technologies of power. Technologies of the self are ways in which we actually relate to ourselves as subjects using power on ourselves, oftentimes within a tradition, a community, where there's some sort of initiation, taking somebody's guidance, but with the idea of bringing about some sort of good for ourselves, which could be salvation, it could be greater control over our own minds and bodies, it could be, self-understanding. There's all sorts of things, and Foucault thinks that this is what is going on in a lot of ancient philosophy, and philosophy is a way of life. So that's a transformative type of power relation. The last thing I'm going to say, because I'm going to get to some of the questions real soon, power relations are not by themselves good or bad. Foucault doesn't take the sort of Enlightenment view that we could ever have a society that was not like full of power relations. And any power relation that could be good in this particular instance could be turned to other things, could go bad, could be corrupted. Likewise, even the things that we often view as, oh, that's really bad, tyrannical power. Well, there was probably some reason why some people actually saw some good in that, you know. So things are not as cut and dried as, well, we need to get away from power, or there's some sort of utopian project. Foucault is pretty suspicious about those sorts of things, and the things that he actually, in history kind of went, took a positive attitude towards, usually turned out to go quite bad. Think about the Iranian Revolution, for example. Um, but Foucault wants us to become educated in what we are, which is human beings, that is, creatures that are in power relations that antedate us, and which we replicate, and which we use, and which we sometimes forget about what we're doing. And he's interested in sort of like, not diagnosing, but describing and differentiating the different ways in which these work, you know. And so that's what his work does. There is one other thing that I do want to get to later on, and this is a question sort of about how applicable is his theorizing, which only went up until the 1980s, to the situations that we find ourselves in, like, the internet, right? Or corporate power, or all sorts of other things that fit into, well, people want to talk about the pandemic and biopower and all that sort of stuff. So, all right, so let's start at the start. So here's an interesting question from Max Mackin. Is there a risk that Foucault's idea power relations can lead to paranoia or cynical reason, as Peter Sloterdijk seems to argue in Critique of Cynical Reason? No. There isn't a risk that Foucault's idea will lead to that. There is a risk that people misreading Foucault in light of their own emotional drives and inadequacies and worries and all the other stuff they're putting into the hopper will use Foucault to do that just as much as I mean, you can read Nietzsche and be like, holy shit, this opens up the world to me. Or you can read Nietzsche and be like, oh, this is a terrible world, right? Isn't it interesting how we can take the same thinker and find very different responses by people to it? So, I mean, I don't read Foucault and wind up being paranoid. So, I mean, I've been reading Foucault now for 25 longer than that years. I mean, the first book that I got by him was given to me, The Order of Things, and it hasn't turned me into a paranoiac. So you got to ask with people who make these sorts of claims, what else are they putting into this? Because it's not just Foucault's ideas, power relations, that's doing that. There's got to be a lot of other things in the background that are contributing to that, right? And we could say this similarly about the crappy takes. So somebody mentioned Stephen Hicks and his terrible book on postmodernism, which is where Jordan Peterson got his ideas from. And it's sort of garbage in, garbage out. But there were plenty of other people. I mean, even I don't think that Habermas truly understood Foucault when he was sort of lining him up as in what is it, the discourse of critical modernity. Now, the difference between a Habermas misinterpreting Foucault and even McIntyre, I would say, doesn't quite do Foucault justice. The difference between those types and a Stephen Hicks or a Jordan Peterson or whoever is pretty vast. But it's quite possible to get things wrong, right? Biopower. So Connor brought biopower up. People are interested in that. It's an interesting term. It's not, Foucault's not naming something new in talking about biopower. And I think a lot of people get sort of sucked into it and they're like, well, this is a sexy idea. Biopower is just another modality of power relations, right? It's power relations with specific kinds of objects. The bios, the life, the living thing. So, you're involved in biopower when you take a coronavirus test, right? And now it tells you that you need to quarantine for whatever the strictures are. It used to be 14 days. Now it's like 5 days. Who knows what it'll be tomorrow. But somebody's telling you what to do. Somebody is exerting actions on your possible range of actions, right? And the testing fits into that. And whether or not you get vaccinated fits into that. And it's really quite, this is going to be a little bit of a rant. It's funny to see all the conspiracy theorists and quite frankly whack jobs out there in red state America who are mirrored, by the way, in other places as well, but we have it particularly bad here, who think that they're going to be microchipped, or the virus is taking away their agency, and they resort to all this weird folk medicine bullshit. And I've got relatives who are like that. So, I'm not just speaking from seeing what's going on here in my state, but, from experience and engaging with these poor bastards. If you think that being manipulated by political parties to be against the coronavirus vaccine isn't somehow biopower, and the coronavirus vaccine is biopower, then you don't understand biopower. It's there's all sorts of things going on. Biopower happens when insurance companies, I remember when this first started happening, when you get your insurance through your job, and I remember them launching these initiatives where, if you quit smoking, your premiums would go down, or you get into a weight loss program, your premiums would go down, and if you didn't do that sort of thing, maybe your premiums would go up. Well, that's biopower. I mean, this is not a mysterious thing. And Foucault, in his discussions of biopower, he says governments have been doing this for a couple hundred years now. And we can see this extend into other areas as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be a government; it could be a corporation, right? So there's really nothing mysterious about biopower. It's just another type of power, right? All right, so I'm gonna skip the stuff about Jesus and Lenin and evangelicals because I don't see any relevance to the Foucault stuff. Mark says the sum total of my exposure to Foucault is in my coursework was being shown clips of his debate with Chomsky, and somebody else brings up the debate with Chomsky as well, which I have not looked at for years and years and years and years, and I don't really have much to say about it, frankly. Um, Chomsky, I'll say this, is one of those people who I encountered when I was in grad school, and I found his conceptions of linguistics just, I couldn't take them seriously because they were so compared to the other stuff that I was looking at, they were so behind the times and off base. His political stuff was pretty interesting, and remains so. It's a very consistent message, right? And this is where we could talk about we could spin off into Foucault and talk about, well, what are Foucault's politics actually? He's getting kicked around a lot, all over the place. Was he a neoliberal? Did the CIA fund him? What's going on with this guy? And one of the things that you want to understand in order to make sense out of like Foucault, and not just him, but Deleuze and Derrida and a lot of these, they were being called the new philosophers back in the 70s, is that they were kind of fed up with the failures of both the right and the left in European politics, specifically in French politics. And they didn't buy. I mean, they saw all the hypocrisy and party line bullshit, and the fact that within the trade unions they weren't really working in democratic ways as they claim to be. And I think they react against that in part. And Foucault wants to really problematize, in the sense of saying, hey, there's more here to explore, political relations and political institutions, and claims that we're going to move towards a some sort of better future that there's a program for. And we're still doing this kind of crap today, you know um and so I think that Foucault doesn't have an easy politics. It's not like you could say, well, he would. I mean, he wouldn't here in America. He wouldn't be lining up with the Republicans. He would say, "Wow, look at these fucking nut jobs." But I don't think he'd be like a establishment Democrat in any respect. And I don't know that he'd be all that uh, congenial with the harder left or anything like that. So then would he be a radical centrist? No, because centrists are mostly, they're really on the right anyway, is what they demonstrate themselves to be when they open their mouths. I mean, he would be somebody who'd say, look, individuals, they can participate in larger political structures, but they need to figure out what the hell is actually going on, how power works, how the relations are connected with each other. He cautions, by the way, in that essay in here, Subject and Power, don't confuse power relations with politics or with institutions. Power relations are a wider net, and these other things figure within them. All right. Max says, how does Foucault on power relations relate to essentialism? Totally depends on what you mean by essentialism. That's not a univocal term that people can just throw out there, right? He seems to, from my reading, argue that the medical juridical apparatus creates identities. Is he rejecting identity essentialism? I mean, if that's what you mean by essentialism, thinking that we have identities, we're all essentialists. Then even those of us who claim to be anti-essentialist have some sort of identity. So that's probably not what you mean by that, right? And identities are not just a substantive but a relational term. You have an identity in relation to all sorts of stuff. I mean, I'm showing my identity as a lover of budgie right now by wearing this shirt that I wore back from the gym after I did my workout. You know, I think it's this guy right here who died recently, and you know, kind of nostalgic about that. Um, is that identity in the same way as like as you're calling it the uh, medico-juridical apparatus? I mean, and we got to be careful with this. What do we mean when we say the medico-juridical apparatus? Is there some sort of weird skeleton out there that's an apparatus? No, it's going to be things like the hospital that you go to for your checkups, you know, and yours may be very different than mine. If you're in Britain and you're going to, you know, a national healthcare service funded stuff, that's very different than me going to Freighter Health, you know. There isn't a single apparatus out there that's doing all this dirty work. There's all sorts of apparati, and some of them resemble each other and some of them don't, you know, and they're not all part of one seamless thing. And they give us things that we can call identities. I mean, are you just reducible to being a patient? I mean, if you get COVID and you're stuck on a respirator, um, you may be, right, because you have no agency anymore. But your family may be in there pestering the doctor to give you ivermectin, in which case your identity is, you know, lined up with alternative medicine slash conspiracy theory people about that, and you may not even have chosen that. Like, you might be the poor bastard who's got a crazy spouse who's like, we got to use this stuff, don't use the standard treatment," or something like that, and that could be part of your identity as well, right? um, I think that, you know, there's lots of ways in which Foucault thinks identity is created. How that connects up with what you're calling essentialism, I don't really know. I mean, do you think that we have like fixed identities that are our essences? Um, if that's what bothers you, then that's not what Foucault is actually saying. Um, so I think that this one I have to punt on, right? Um, Chris, Foucault is definitely against sweeping claims. As you said, this can be seen not just from the different periods and changing perspectives, but the desire to want to write anonymously. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty important to not just Foucault, lots and lots of authors, right, want to be able to make progress in their work. I mean, I'm not somebody of the stature of Foucault, but you know, I came into graduate school and my intent was to study philosophy of language. So I came in, you know, armed with you know, some pretty good French and some decent German, and working on Latin, and having, you know, puttered around a little bit with Mandarin. And you know, I was reading stuff in continental philosophy of language and in analytic philosophy of language, and then I got into semiotics, and then, you know, eventually that led me to get really really interested in Derrida, and then, you know, being interested in Derrida meant actually like thinking about some of the people that he wrote about and taking them seriously in ways that continental people weren't, and, you know, learning Greek and studying Plato and Aristotle much more closely, and then to work on my Latin, studying medieval thinkers. And pretty soon, I'm no longer a philosophy of language guy. I'm now a historian of philosophy kind of guy slash philosophy as a way of life guy, working on all sorts of other thinkers. This is kind of normal, right? And so, you know, so Foucault goes through what get identified as stages in his development. Um, and you know, do these stages really correspond to, you know, like here's one period, here's another, here's another. You know, you kind of move into a period in a whole set of little changes that you make. But you know, if you think about Foucault's work, um, there's a lot of stuff going into it, and there's a lot of being very careful to like try to pick apart all the different things and distinguish them and say what they are. I mean, so great example of this, right? In The Subject and Power, he tells. Here's just one good example. Generally, it can be said there's three types of struggles: against forms of domination, against forms of exploitation that separate individuals from what they produce, or against that which ties the individual to himself and submits him to others this way, struggles against subjection, against forms of subjectivity and submission. I mean, that's a nice distinction right there. And then he goes on immediately and says, by the way, these often like inform each other, and they're not so easily distinguishable, right? If you think about working a shitty job for, we'll say for the man making pizzas, which is something I've actually done. There's exploitation going on. There's probably some domination going on, and there's probably a little bit of subjection going on until they change their way of punching in, and now there's like more you're caught up in some digital networks and stuff like that. There's more subjectification, or they start they get interested in like employee training and morale, and now you're being invited to like tell people what you think about the shitty pizza parlor that you work in, where you're getting paid pennies compared to what the place is making. These all kind of figure into each other. And if we were doing a Foucauldian analysis, what we'd want to do is bring to bear the tools that Foucault provides us with and see whether they help us make sense out of the condition that we're in. And the answer might in some cases be no. Sometimes Foucault might not actually be all that helpful. All right. Mark asked if I'm familiar with Achille Mbembe's notion of necropolitics as a response to Foucault's biopolitics. Only in the most vague sense. I mean, I've sat in on a few conference papers where people were bringing that up, but I don't know if they're properly presenting Mbembe's notion of necropolitics. And a lot of it was, unfortunately, people who were like, this is the key that answers everything. And so I didn't get that much out of it. So I don't have too much to say about that. Max, how did Foucault's theory of power relations relate to his idea of governmentality? Governmentality is a specific way in which power relations get structured in terms of, on the one hand, states, and then all these like institutions that figure into it. And actually, this is a good place to talk about that issue of the state. Some people have some people think that Foucault focused too much on the nation state, and that we should be looking at other things as other ways in which power gets determined. And Foucault does say, again, this is in The Subject and Power, that the state has historically now a new kind of centrality, right? And this actually ties into governmentality and disciplinarity and stuff like that. So there's two things I'm going to read to you here out of this essay. One is also good because it shows that he doesn't think everything's a prison. What is to be understood by the disciplining of societies in Europe since the 18th century is not, of course, that the individuals who are part of them become more and more obedient, nor that all societies become like barracks, schools, or prisons. Rather, it is that an increasingly controlled, more rational and economic process of adjustment has been sought between productive activities, communication networks, and the play of power relations. That seems pretty right. Now, is it the same in every place? No, it's going to be tighter in some places, looser in other places, but it is a sort of in general, where the trajectory is going. Now, a little bit later on, he talks about states. Where is this? Actually, I'm going to read you a third thing, a second. So this is talking about his discussion of power relations. What would be proper to a relationship of power is that it be a mode of action on actions. That is, power relations are rooted deep in the social nexus, not a supplementary structure over and above society whose radical effacement one could perhaps dream of. To live in society is in any event to live in such a way that one can act on the actions of others. A society without power relations can only be an abstraction, which, be it said in passing, makes it all the more politically necessary. The analysis of power relations in a given society, their historical formation, the source of their strength or fragility, the conditions that are necessary to transform some or to abolish others. This gives you an idea of what he's up to, right? All right, so finally here, the state. The third thing, I got a little distracted on the way. He says, this is backing up a little bit. We see why the analysis of power relations within a society cannot be reduced to a study of a series of institutions or even to the study of all those institutions that would merit the name political. Power relations are rooted in the whole network of the social. That is not to say that there is a primary and fundamental principle of power which dominates society down to the smallest detail, but based on this possibility of action on the action of others that is coextensive with every social relationship, various kinds of individual disparity of objectives of the given application of power over ourselves or other will define different kinds of power. The forms and the specific situations of the government of some by others in a given society are multiple. They are, he goes on to say, superimpose, they cross over, limit, and in some cases annul, reinforce one another. Then he goes on. It is certain that in contemporary societies, the state is not simply one of the forms of specific situations of the exercise of power, even if it is the most important, but that in a certain way, all other forms of power relation must refer to it. So there's a centrality there to the state, right? And we have to be careful about taking what a French intellectual says, which is going to be driven, in part by the absolutely centralized French state about other states. But I think he's generally right. So he goes on and he says, this is not because they, power relations, are derived from it. Rather, it is because power relations have come more and more under state control, although this state control has not taken the same form in pedagogical, juridical, economic, or family systems. Using the restricted meaning of the word government, one could say that power relations have become progressively governmentalized. That is to say, elaborated, rationalized, and centralized in the form of or under the auspices of state institutions. Now you could say, okay, well, that's cool. Maybe that was the case in 1980. What about today when privatization has been taken to be such a important thing in America and in Britain to some degree? Well, those are still you when you privatize something, you are bringing in market forces and companies that are doing things, but they're still connected with the state. The state is paying them, right? The state is managing them. There are still all sorts of connections with the state, and the fact that sometimes corporations can act as if they're their own little governments doesn't really change what Foucault is talking about. I mean, the rise of big tech can give us things that appear to us to be like, oh wow, look at this, Apple has more revenue than some GDP. Well, shit, that was the case back in the 50s with some of the multinationals. It's not a radically new idea. And maybe we want to expand beyond just the state, but this, I think the state really does remain pretty central, even if it's pretty ineffective and dysfunctional a lot of the time. So all right, let me see where else people were writing. um let's see. A lot of individual experience about getting the jab, blah, 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 from Milahan, Philosopher's Corner, medical fascism. You know, this probably isn't the place to go on your soapbox about that sort of thing. Max, what are the details of Foucault's genealogical method and how does one use this method? Well, you want to see how it's used, read Foucault and you'll see him using it. And, part of what you do. So let's back up a bit. When we talk about genealogical method, we're not talking about ancestry.com or stuff like that. We're talking about tracing phenomena that some people want to say, oh, they have this nice simple origin that we can make sense of. Think about like evolutionary biology people who are very naive. And are non-genealogical in this respect for the most part. And when they stop being that, they often like shift out of evolutionary biology or psychology. Um, Think about Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. How does he begin it? He says these English psychologists, they want to say the origin of good is in what was useful for the group. How the hell would they know that? We need to actually like see what we've got in history. Now, we don't have we can't like go back to cavemen and stuff like that. But we can like look at language, Nietzsche says. Foucault says, well, hell, we don't have to just look at language. We can look at the records that are there in institutions and see what people are actually saying. And this is what the genealogical method does. It sifts through a significant amount of information. And then it says, all right, how did things develop? And it doesn't say, okay, because something developed from this, it's always going to be this way. Again, reading Nietzsche's genealogy could be very helpful for that. Read essay 2, his discussion of punishment and how punishment might have started out as one thing and then it comes to mean all sorts of other things. That's what Foucault is saying. Institutions, um, by their very nature, develop all these other things. What we call mission creep takes place, right? Um, All right, so that's probably enough about that. Chris, interested in your take through a Foucauldian lens on how someone on the right recently misinterpreted the call for vaccination as max psychosis and missed the generated paranoia of the vaccine. I'm not even sure what all that means, unfortunately. Um, Miss the generated paranoia of the vaccine. That doesn't. I'm having trouble figuring out what those words are supposed to mean. I mean, a lot of people on the right have misinterpreted calls for vaccination for a while. So mass psychosis, anybody can throw anything they want out there about vaccine. Medical fascism is another great example. I mean, if you know anything about fascism, asking people to get vaccinated, calling it medical fascism just strikes me as like the ultimate pearl clutching. And it sort of disqualifies one from being able to have a reasonable conversation. Um, so I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, Foucault would say, a lot of people on the right are based, they have all this language about free thinkers, critical thinkers, and all that, but they're really just being driven by algorithms that feed them garbage and hucksters and who may or may not believe the crap that they're pandering. I mean, if this was like 50, I've said this many times, if this was 30 years ago, and we're back in a different time politically, Republicans and Democrats, both of them would have been for handling this health crisis the way it ought to be handled. And it wouldn't have been, whether you wear a mask, whether you take the vaccine, wouldn't have been politicized the way it has been. But a lot of people made money or careers or got to express their anger about other stuff through doing that. And, I don't think you need a Foucauldian lens to do that. It's pretty straightforward. Georgia, why do centrists appear to be on the right? Because typically you watch them long enough, and their centrism really is just they don't actually give both sides a real take. You just have to look at the things that they say and do over time to figure out that they're just lying to themselves about being independent. They're not really independent. I mean, there may I'll qualify that there may be a few people out there who call themselves centrists who actually turn out to be that way, but you always got to look at them, right, and see what's going on. Max, how did Foucault influence Judith Butler's work on gender performativity? I don't know. I don't know her work well enough to be able to say, here's where Foucault influenced this, this, and this, and this. I would say that, she's not drawing extensively just on Foucault, right? But all sorts of thinkers. The notion that, um, I mean, here's where there could be a connection. So, performativity why do people have to be performative in their gender? And all of us have done this. I mean, I think Butler is onto a lot of stuff and talking about that. I'll give you a prime example. The performativity of masculinity so that other guys won't think that you're gay when you're back in the 80s, and being gay would be like a terrible thing that would make you a social pariah, and give license for all the other guys to beat the crap out of you every single day, take your lunch, push your face into lockers, all that kind of stuff. There were a lot of guys, especially the jocks, who I think were actually closeted and had to pick on some poor bastard as part of their performativity of their masculinity to be tough guys. And the secret was that they were actually the ones who were gay. Now, that's performativity. Why would they have to do that? Well, can you think about this in terms of power relations? I mean, if you've got if you're a jock and you've got a coach who himself is just a totally corrosive influence, like one of our coaches was, who ruined a lot of young men who he coached in football, for example. Terrible guy. Um, there were power relations going on, right? The position of coach to athlete, or to somebody in a gym class. There were power relations between all of the different guys involved, sort of policing each other. It was kind of a rough time back in the 80s here in the Midwest, in terms of sexual politics and gender and stuff like that. So, I mean, that would just be one example of many. Um, Ricky asks, how would Immanuel Kant fit into the current state of affairs? I don't know that Immanuel Kant would fit into the current state of affairs. I'm not sure why that's connected to Foucault. Max, how does Heidegger influence Foucault's theory of power? Not much. Um, I mean, I don't see Heidegger as much of an influence on Foucault. I think, one big influence on Foucault doing the work of going to the archives and seeing what's going on. Nietzsche is certainly a bigger influence than Heidegger is on Foucault. Um, a lot of these obscure philosophers of science in French literature are bigger influences on Foucault than Heidegger would be. Zeno, what book would you recommend to someone new to Foucault? How would you introduce Foucault to someone who hasn't read him? You got two options there. One would be to get this collected volume set, right? Um, Not a bad way to go. You get little bits and pieces. There probably will be a good bit of holy shit, what the hell is this crap experiences. Oh, this is funny. There's a little card in here. Some stuff I was supposed to look up. All right. So these are decent, but I mean, you could also say, well, I want to begin at the beginning. Do I have it? You know, maybe start reading with Madness and Civilization, Birth of the Clinic, right? Um, I don't think that there's one single place that you have to go. Actually, do I have? I thought I had a Foucault reader here, but maybe I don't. I got like a whole shelf of Foucault stuff. So, you know. Um, all right. So I'm going to skip some irrelevant stuff here. Um, Anonymous says, "Am I familiar with Esposito's Immunitas?" I don't even know who Esposito is. Max, how would you say Foucault is reacting to Marx? Okay, so that's a really good question. And actually, I wonder if I do have this still. There's a semiotext. Yeah, there it is. There's a semiotext book, and this is interviews, right? Um, so this is called. This, this wasn't my book originally. This is my friend Gary Mullins. He lent it to me. I never gave it back. When you lend a book, don't expect to get the book back. when I lend books, I don't expect to get back. There is this remarks on Marx, and that would be a good place to start. Um, Foucault, like a lot of I mentioned like Derrida, Lyotard, Deleuze, all these guys of his time, and I would say you could stick earlier guys like Lacan and Bataille in there as well. They think there's something worth getting out of Marx, but that the Marxists themselves often obscure it, mess it up. They're too doctrinaire about it, right? And so you can say that this is actually kind of an interesting point. Um, Analysis of social conditions in terms of classes. That's something that anybody can do. You don't have to be a Marxist to do that. Here in America, when somebody does that, they're like, that's a Marxist analysis. Well, no, Foucault thinks that you can do that too. Um, you can't reduce everything to class the way sometimes, kind of vulgar Marxism does. But class exists and class matters, and class really does determine a lot in power relations. So there's a lot there. You heard me talk about exploitation, right? Foucault is interested in economic activities, institutions, how they develop. He thinks that lots and lots of people, Marx's theory about how capitalism takes surplus labor, gives it to the capitalists who then reinvest it into the systems itself. The workers get poorer and poorer. Not only do the workers get poorer and poorer, Foucault would say, the workers get more and more controlled as well. So it's sort of you could say it's not an unqualified endorsement of Marx, um, but there's something there. I think he also thinks that Marxist regimes are typically going to follow the same sort of trajectory of power as capitalist regimes. Zeno's got another good question here. Is reading Foucault's French difficult? I'm teaching myself French. Yeah, Foucault's French is difficult. Pretty much, this is again a generalization. After like the 1950s, French writers become way more difficult. If you read somebody like, Maurice Merleau-Ponty or um, Maurice Blondel or Jacques Maritain would be a good example. Um, their writing is a lot more clear in that earlier part of the century, and they remain clear. The new kids on the block, they become part of this movement where everything has to be made way more showy and ornate and plays on words and crap like that, and that can get a little precious some of the time. That said, reading Foucault is not as bad as reading Derrida. You know, Even reading Deleuze is, especially if Deleuze is writing on his own without Guattari, is not as bad as reading Derrida in that respect. But it's just kind of what comes with the path, and a lot of it is just preciousness, unfortunately. So reading Sartre, read Sartre before you read Foucault in French, because Sartre is a lot more clear as a writer. His French is pretty straightforward. Um, so Max has a good question here. When Foucault says in relation to the history of madness, he's doing a history of silence. What does he mean by this? Trying to resuscitate what's been silenced and what has been left out, what has been overlooked, what has been um, shoved under, but we have traces of, and we can recover those and reconstitute a story about, right? So that's important. Um, Moises has an irrelevant question. We're talking about Foucault here. So um, Max says Foucault engages with Kant in what is enlightenment. How does Foucault interact with Kant? Foucault thinks that Kant is an important thinker on the way. He's got some interesting ideas. Enlightenment doesn't turn out to be as simple as Kant made it out to be. But Kant was at a different period when we could be a little bit more optimistic about. Like, I mean, if you think about it, what is enlightenment? And Kant's project, the moral project, less the epistemological project, is trying to do what Foucault says we can't have, which is a society without power. You know, the kingdom of ends would be, one where human dignity is completely respected. Foucault doesn't think that's ever going to happen, but that doesn't mean we can't like work for making it a bit better. Devani, how would you define Foucault's project? What do you think he was after in his philosophy? Many things. I don't define people's projects. I don't define much of anything because I think that definitions are something we earn rather than begin from, as Plato himself said, and Aristotle echoed in many cases. I think Foucault was by himself interested in the stuff that he was working on and kind of fascinated by it. And he also wanted to, like he said in the essay that I've quoted to you several times here now, Subject and Power, he wants to, why don't we just read his words? He wants to do these analyses because he wants to afford us certain possibilities. Creating a history of the different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subject. And why do that? Well, because that allows him to figure out where we could go from here, you know? So, NL, order of things really changed my mind a lot, really influential for my historical project. Yeah, it's kind of funny because, Foucault claims not to be a structuralist, but the order of things is about as structuralist a work as you can possibly get. You can even find him without diagramming it, making the Gramscian semiotic square. Okay, so Mark has a good question here, and this is what I'm going to go out on because I do have to get to other work today, unfortunately, before I watch the Packers either win or lose. Could you please elaborate on Foucault's concept of power as between subjects? So this is a really important point. Foucault thinks that power relations are between subjects, people who have some degree of agency, people who maybe don't know themselves thoroughly or anything like that, but certainly can have responses, can take responsibility for themselves. And when relations are to the point where you make it so somebody doesn't have any lines of possible rejection or escape, it's no longer really power relations. You think it's sort of just treating a person as a mechanical object, right? So we are subjects, and power relations are between subjects. Foucault says that power relations are where a subject acts upon another subject's possibilities of action. So, tells them, so let's consider a restaurant, right? Power relations exist in ordering a drink. The server comes to the table and the server starts telling me about the specials. And I say, no, I don't want to hear about all that crap. Go get me a brandy old fashioned. That's a particular drink here in Wisconsin, right? And then they're like, well, oh, okay. And they go off and do it. I've just made them do something, right? Is what we would normally say. Foucault would say, I acted in such a way as to try to steer them into a certain mode of action. Now, the server could have said, shut up, sir. I'm going to tell you the specials. There could have been consequences to that, but that was still a possibility for them. Instead, they did something else. That's a really simple way of illustrating that. And now it can get much, much larger. We can think about like how a form confines our ability to do something. We can think about this format that we're in right here, and what we're confined to doing by virtue of the techniques of communication that it makes possible for us, which is something that Foucault is interested in. So, all right. So I didn't answer everything, but irrelevant stuff we're not going to answer in these political things. I already answered the thing about what to read with Foucault. I don't think there's a necessary reading before reading Foucault. Read Foucault. I'm going to say that with every philosopher. You want to read Hegel? read Hegel. You can look at videos and you know read preparatory stuff if you want to, but sooner or later you got to make the dive and actually read the person. In this case, Seneca, right? So, all right. So that's probably enough for today, and we'll do another one next month. I'm not sure what the topic will be, but we'll figure it out then. And thanks for all the questions, comments. Hopefully, this clarified some things about Foucault. Uh, to end it, complicated thinker, lots of stuff going on there. Don't buy into any like sweeping assertions that everything is power or it's all a prison. That's not Foucault. That's somebody else making something out of Foucault. And yeah. All right. So I'll see all of you down the line somewhere else.